Venezuelan ship kicks off a showdown with the U.S. Navy. So Nicolas Maduro suffered a historic humiliation because of it. In the last few days, we've seen how far Venezuela pushed back against the American Navy, but what nobody expected was the shock that was coming. Hit vessels, F-35 fighters on standby, high-level accusations of military aggression flying back and forth, and Venezuelan civilians being urgently called up to train with weapons. All of this points to something that seems unavoidable: a conflict between the United States and Venezuela. To grasp the magnitude of what's happening now, we need to go back 20 years when Hugo Chavez turned Venezuela into the epicenter of Latin American anti-Americanism. Chavez didn't just challenge Washington with words. He systematically built a military alliance with Russia that was supposed to, at least in theory, act as a counterweight to American power in the region. For 2 decades, Venezuela became the biggest buyer of Russian weapons in Latin America, dropping more than $11 billion on Sukhoi Su-30 fighters, S-300 air defense systems, and even letting Russian Tu-160 bombers use Venezuelan bases. It was a bold strategy: build a military alliance strong enough to discourage any American military adventure in the region. When Maduro took power in 2013, he inherited not just that military infrastructure, but also Chavez's confrontational rhetoric. For years, he kept the same defiant tone, the same grandstanding threats, and the same confidence that Moscow would provide effective protection against U.S. pressure. The problem is, Maduro had never really been put to the test, until now. The current situation is the first real test of this Venezuelan military strategy in more than 2 decades. And the results are devastatingly clear. All the anti-American military prep of the last 20 years has proven completely useless in the face of the show of force Trump decided to stage in the Caribbean. When Donald Trump decided to send a message to Caracas, he didn't do it halfway. At the end of August 2025, an impressive military fleet started positioning itself strategically near Venezuela's coast. We're not talking 1 or 2 ships on a routine patrol. We're talking a display of military power that outstrips anything seen in the Caribbean since the 1962 missile crisis. The numbers are just jaw-dropping. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, each one a floating fortress capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously hundreds of kilometers away. A nuclear-powered submarine able to stay submerged for months, loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles. More than 1,400 Marines ready for amphibious operations. Boeing P-8 Poseidon and E-3 Sentry electronic surveillance aircraft weaving a monitoring net that makes any Venezuelan military move instantly detectable. But maybe the most eye-popping stat is this: the 288 strike missiles carried just on those 3 American destroyers add up to 7 times more firepower than what was used on the first night of the shock and awe operation that wrecked Iraq in 2003. To put that in even clearer terms, the U.S. strike on Iraq used 41 Tomahawk missiles on day 1. Those destroyers parked off Venezuela are packing almost 300 similar missiles. For years, American threats against Venezuela were mostly economic: sanctions, banking blockades, diplomatic pressure. Maduro got used to that pattern. Washington talked big, slapped on some sanctions, Caracas fired back with fiery rhetoric, and eventually tensions faded without direct military consequences. September 2nd, 2025 blew that pattern up. For the first time in decades, U.S. naval forces carried out a lethal strike on a vessel that had departed Venezuelan territory, killing crew members in international waters. It wasn't a maritime incident or a boarding gone wrong. It was a deliberate military operation, publicly announced and executed with surgical precision. According to U.S. intelligence, the targeted boat was suspected of carrying illicit substances. But the implications go way beyond the alleged cargo. It marks the moment Washington chose to treat Venezuelan vessels not as ships from a sovereign country, but as legit targets in a counterterrorism operation. Maduro's response was immediate and telling. The Venezuelan strongman instantly labeled the action direct aggression, not a simple diplomatic flare-up. For the first time in years, his words sounded genuinely worried, without the usual bluster. It was like Maduro finally realized the rules of the game had changed for good. But Trump was just getting started. The American president seemed dead set on making it clear that the first strike wasn't a one-off, but the start of a new systematic policy against what he calls Venezuelan narco-terrorist organizations. 11 days later, on September 14th, U.S. naval forces executed a second, even more lethal strike. This time, 3 people were killed when American missiles hit another suspect vessel near the Venezuelan coast. What made this second strike especially humiliating for Maduro was the way Trump announced it, through his social media, like it was a casual weather update. The implied message was brutal. Lethal military strikes on Venezuelan targets had become so routine they only merited a presidential tweet. Trump was deliberately normalizing military force against Venezuela, turning lethal ops into press blurbs. The third strike came just a day later, cementing a sequence that left the world stunned. In less than 2 weeks, 3 Venezuelan vessels had been attacked and destroyed with multiple deaths, and the American president personally confirmed each operation like they were wins in a video game. Faced with this string of lethal strikes, the Venezuelan regime tried to spin an alternative narrative to blunt the humiliation. Venezuela hotly disputed the American version, claiming the dead weren't cartel members, but innocent fishermen and traders. It was a Hail Mary to reframe the strikes from justified counter-terror ops to the killing of innocent civilians. But that calm strategy backfired. If the dead were really innocent civilians, where was the Venezuelan military response? Why didn't the mighty Bolivarian Air Force intercept the American vessels responsible for the strikes? Why didn't the invincible Venezuelan Navy protect its territorial waters? The attempt at victimhood only highlighted Venezuela's military powerlessness even more. Maduro was basically admitting he couldn't even protect civilian boats near his own coast, let alone take on the U.S. Navy in a straight fight. Washington flat out rejected those Venezuelan claims, maintaining that every target struck was legit and tied to international trafficking of illicit substances. More importantly, the Americans made it clear they'd keep running similar operations whenever they deemed necessary. Faced with this brutal reminder of his military impotence, Maduro made a move that showed just how desperate the regime is. He called Venezuelan civilians up for direct military training. We're not talking symbolic drills or patriotic pageants. We're talking civilians learning to handle heavy weapons at real military facilities. Starting September 12, 2025, a surreal scene began playing out at barracks across Venezuela. Housewives, college students, shopkeepers, and retirees learning shooting techniques with AK-47s and other weapons of war. Per Maduro's own instructions, the goal was to prep the population to defend the homeland against foreign invaders, a not-so-subtle nod to the American forces staged in the region. This civilian mobilization is something totally unprecedented in modern Venezuelan history. Even Hugo Chavez, in his most confrontational moments with Washington, never went as far as calling the general population in for direct military training. The country already had the so-called Bolivarian militia, a civilian arm of the armed forces created under Chavez, but that was a specific organization with volunteers, not a general call-up. The contrast says it all. While Trump shows real military power through precise lethal ops, Maduro answers by dragging desperate civilians into training that, at best, would be useless against U.S. military tech. It's like trying to fight supersonic jets with slingshots, a pathetic display of desperation dressed up as military prep. But the civilian mobilization was just the start of Maduro's panicked response. In a move swinging between military paranoia and last-ditch strategy, the Venezuelan strongman announced the creation of 284 battlefronts spread across the entire country. Venezuelan troops and security forces were assigned to protect the Venezuelan coast from end to end. Those numbers look revealing once you consider how impractical they are. Venezuela's coastline runs about 2,800 kilometers. That's one battlefront every 10 kilometers of coast. For a country with an armed force estimated at under 120,000 personnel, spreading coastal defenses, that thin means laughably weak positions, maybe a few dozen soldiers per front. Military analysts don't read this as any kind of serious defensive plan, but as a desperate attempt to look busy militarily and offset the international humiliation. It's a PR strategy dressed up as military planning. Create the impression of massive readiness, when in reality, forces are being spread so thin they're even more vulnerable. Even the wording screams desperation. Battlefronts suggests active fighting, but these positions are purely defensive and scattered. In any real confrontation, those 284 isolated spots would be taken out one by one within hours by U.S. air superiority. To get why Trump is treating Venezuela with such military severity, you've got to understand a fundamental shift in the American view of Maduro's regime. Washington no longer sees Venezuela as a country in crisis under a dictator. It sees territory controlled by an international criminal organization. In July 2025, the United States officially labeled Nicolas Maduro the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, an outfit Washington describes as narco-terrorist that has taken effective control of the Venezuelan state apparatus. This isn't some rhetorical or diplomatic label. It's a legal designation that allows the U.S. to use military force against related targets, just like it does with Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The name Cartel de los Soles refers to Venezuelan military insignia, the suns that mark ranks in the military hierarchy. U.S. intelligence claims high-ranking Venezuelan officers built an international criminal network that uses state resources and authority to facilitate drug trafficking, money laundering, and other illicit activities. That shift in perception explains the recent hard-edged military operations. Trump isn't striking vessels from a sovereign country. He's hitting targets of a terrorist organization that happens to control Venezuelan territory. The distinction might sound semantic, but the legal and military implications are huge. What's most striking is that this American view of the Venezuelan regime is gaining traction internationally. The European Parliament recently passed a resolution to add Maduro's cartel to its official terrorist lists. Argentina followed suit, formally classifying the Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. We're watching an international consensus forming that legitimizes military action against the Venezuelan regime, not as intervention in a sovereign country, but as global counterterrorism operations. It's a paradigm shift that completely isolates Maduro and makes his claims of national sovereignty irrelevant on the world stage. Even countries that traditionally bash U.S. foreign policy are staying quiet in the face of this new label. Russia and China, Venezuela's top international backers, aren't publicly defending Maduro against the terrorist leader accusations, a clear sign that even Moscow and Beijing see the Venezuelan regime as politically toxic. On top of the terrorist designation, Trump doubled the reward for Maduro's capture to a staggering $50 million. That puts the Venezuelan strongman in the same league as the historic bounties offered for leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. The practical impact goes way beyond the dollar amount. Any international company, bank, or even government that keeps doing business with Maduro now risks being seen as enabling a terrorist organization. The bounty turns any international deal with the Venezuelan regime into a high-risk legal and reputational gamble. For Maduro personally, the bounty means he's basically become an international fugitive. Traveling to any country with an extradition treaty with the U.S. is now off the table. Even neutral countries might see grabbing Maduro as a financially tempting op, given the reward on his head. Now that we've got the political context, let's talk the brutal military facts that explain why all of Maduro's threats sound like empty chest thumping. The numbers are painfully clear. Venezuela simply doesn't have the military capability to confront the United States in any conceivable scenario. Starting with the Navy. The Venezuelan Navy has roughly 17,000 personnel, and its most modern ship is an Almirante Clemente Lupo-class frigate bought from Italy back in the 1980s. By contrast, each one of those 3 American destroyers off the Venezuelan coast packs more individual firepower than the entire Venezuelan fleet combined. The missile numbers are even more revealing. The 288 strike missiles on the American destroyers are 40 times the arsenal used in the shock and awe operation against Iraq. To spell out that superiority, a single American destroyer carries more missiles than the entire offensive capacity of the Venezuelan Air Force. And the Venezuelan air arm isn't any better off. Even with the Russian Sukhoi Su-30 fighters bought under Chavez, Venezuela can't contest the American air umbrella in the region. The U.S. has Boeing P-8 Poseidon and E-3 Sentry surveillance aircraft in place, building a monitoring net that makes practically any Venezuelan military move instantly detectable. For 2 decades, Venezuela spun a narrative that its Russian arms spending would provide effective protection against U.S. military pressure. More than $11 billion went into Russian military gear, making Venezuela Moscow's top arms buyer in Latin America. Hugo Chavez had pictured a sophisticated military strategy: build a defensive alliance with Russia strong enough to discourage American military adventures in the region. Sukhoi Su-30 fighters, S-300 air defense systems, BMP, 3 armor vehicles, even ammo plants with Russian tech. Everything seemed to point to a Venezuela militarily ready to resist external pressure. The current American show of force has brutally exposed how useless that strategy was. Russia, even after sending Tu-160 bombers for drills in Venezuela in 2018 and opening training centers in the country, simply can't project effective naval power in the Caribbean against the U.S. Navy. The core problem is geography and logistics. Russia's Atlantic Fleet doesn't have nearby bases to sustain a lasting military presence in the Caribbean. When Trump chose to flex military muscle in the region, Moscow didn't even try to send ships to balance the American presence, a clear sign that even Russia recognizes U.S. naval supremacy in the Caribbean as uncontestable. Despite Maduro's isolation, the American military escalation in the region does raise legit concerns among Latin American geopolitics watchers. Experts fear that a more direct U.S. move against Venezuela could destabilize all of Latin America, setting dangerous precedents for future interventions. Historian Rodolfo Queiroz Laterza warns that the continent's existing political polarization, especially in Brazil, could be weaponized for geopolitical ends. Groups cheering pressure on Venezuela could clash with those condemning any U.S. military action, creating extra regional instability that spills beyond Venezuela's borders. There's also concern that successful U.S. ops against Venezuela might encourage Washington to use similar methods against other Latin American governments deemed problematic. Labeling regimes as terrorist organizations could become a standard U.S. foreign policy tool in the region. Savvier military analysts see the current American moves not just as a show of force, but as a complex psyops campaign. The main goal wouldn't necessarily be to topple Maduro militarily, but to make crystal clear the impotence of regimes that challenge American hegemony and force behavior changes through public humiliation. That read explains why U.S. actions are focused on pinpoint strikes and naval shows instead of broader military hits on Venezuelan infrastructure. Trump seems to be sending a calibrated message. I can blow up whatever I want, whenever I want, but I'm choosing restraint for now. Venezuelan political scientists say Trump mainly wants to send a message of authority to China and Russia, powers that have been expanding their footprint in Latin America. Venezuela serves as a brutal example of what can happen to countries that directly challenge American supremacy in its traditional spheres of influence. The strategy looks like it's working to a T. Venezuelan insiders report growing nerves at the top of the Chavista hierarchy, with emergency meetings happening daily at the Miraflores Palace. The civilian military training call-up and the creation of those battlefronts are being read as signs a regime is genuinely terrified about its ability to keep control under U.S. pressure. One of the most fascinating angles of this crisis is how external military pressure is exposing internal cracks in the Venezuelan regime. Venezuelan officers privately admit the country is on permanent alert, but off the record they acknowledge the overwhelming superiority of U.S. military power. That private admission clashes hard with Maduro's public talk about defending Venezuela's sacred soil and building invincible battlefronts. There's a growing disconnect between the regime's public messaging and the reality acknowledged by its own military. Sources close to Venezuela's top brass say there are internal debates about whether it's even viable to keep confronting Washington militarily. Some Venezuelan generals are reportedly asking in private whether it's worth sticking with the confrontational rhetoric when it could trigger real military strikes that lay bare the national armed forces' fragility. What we've witnessed in these last few months isn't just another chapter in Latin America's geopolitical tensions. It's a historic demonstration of the hard limits of authoritarian regimes' power in the face of American military supremacy in the 21st century. Nicolas Maduro has been humiliated in a way that goes beyond the man himself and has become a historic marker for what happens when you challenge the United States militarily. The U.S. naval ops, the lethal strikes on Venezuelan vessels, the terrorist leader label, and the regime's panicked response have set a new paradigm in hemispheric relations that'll echo for decades. Venezuela's response, calling civilians in for military training and creating hundreds of battlefronts, only underscores the scale of the regime's military impotence. It's like watching someone try to fight a battle tank with a medieval sword, a pathetic display that only highlights the opponent's overwhelming superiority. This crisis is a final warning to any regime in Latin America or anywhere else thinking about directly challenging the United States. The era of tolerance for narco-terrorist organizations disguised as governments is over, and Maduro found that out in the most humiliating way possible. For the Venezuelan strongman, only bad options remain: capitulate gradually and lose internal legitimacy, or keep resisting and face mounting military pressure that could eventually wipe his regime out completely. Either way, Maduro's already lost. The only question is whether his fall will be slow and humiliating or quick and devastating. The Caribbean has once again turned into a stage for American power projection, but this time the message is crystal clear and permanent. Challenging Washington militarily in the 21st century isn't just pointless. It's a guaranteed, real-time, globally broadcast humiliation.